Okay, looks like we have everyone who's joining us today. That's great. My name is Mark Walker. I'm here with Amy Carlson, the Director of Customer Success on Strongpoint. And we are going to be talking to you today about a new approach to accelerating SOD projects. Now, this is a new approach. It's not a product announcement. It's not necessarily a set of techniques that you can only use with Strongpoint, although we're building it into our methodology, and we thought we could share it with the community, and certainly it's consistent with our ethos, which is to accelerate compliance by using hard facts, by using data to get things done more efficiently. So before we start and talk about what the new approach is, I want to just lay down some basic terms that we're going to be using. And just make sure everyone has a common understanding. I'm sure most of you, by deciding to come to an SOD seminar, have a pretty good grasp of this. The first idea is what is separation of duties? And the key thing about separation of duties definition is that the same user should not be able to perform multiple parts of the same transaction flow without approval. Understanding this is very important. Understanding the underlying parts, able to and without approval, is very, very important to understanding where phantom or potentially problematic or difficult to resolve conflicts are going to come from, and also how you can resolve them. So we're going to keep coming back to these themes of ability and then approval processes. The second thing is that there's a separate idea that we need to always consider in terms of compliance behavior or IT general controls that relate to roles and permissions, which is access control. And some permissions, example admin rights or changing the chart of accounts, are so significant that they should never be granted without prior approval. And Strongpoint has built-in capabilities to completely block the grants of these rights or to flag that they were changed without approval. But the principle is that not all things we need to worry about during an SOD project are multi-sided. They're not just if you can do A, you shouldn't be able to do B. Sometimes it's just you shouldn't be able to do A without approval in advance. And then the third idea is mitigating controls. In many NetSuite companies, there aren't enough bodies in the room to completely solve the SOD issues by actually creating different permissions and keeping the permissions completely separate. And so we always need to think that the simplest path to resolving things, presuming that the conflict is in fact real, are to choose different types of controls. And the types of controls that you would choose depend upon the situation, but they either are blocking controls, process controls, or detective controls. So blocking controls are simply a customization that the user can't change that prevents them from doing the act in question. And a classic example of this would be preventing somebody from, or giving somebody a form that prevented them from having access to the fields they would have to use in order to cause the action concerned. So the most extreme example of this would be to put their access in view-only mode, so they can't actually do anything. So giving somebody access to data in view-only mode is a blocking control. A process control deals with the other side of this. It deals with the approval part of it, and it says a mandatory workflow that imposes an approval process on one side or the other. Now, when we say workflow, we're saying workflow generally. You might actually be using a NetSuite workflow. This could also be implemented with scripting. It could also be implemented in some other way with a checking approval process. A classic example of this being the journal entry approval process, where there's somebody can create the approval and some journal entry and somebody else approves it. Or of course, in some companies, there's a more complex approval process relating to that. But that's process control. And the reason it's a control is that no one person can do all of the steps on a single transaction. They might have the right to do those steps generically, but on a single transaction, they can only do step 1 or step 2. They can't do both, right? And the third type is a detective control. And this is the fallback type. It's the easiest to implement. It's the one supported by Strongpoint's agent product. And essentially, if you want to think of it, it's when we use saved searches to extract data and then have somebody review them as part of the closing process. That's a detective control. And in that case, we're simply saying that the person they could do it, but they couldn't get away with it. So they would get caught. And the frequency and the detail of the review will generally depend upon the risk in question. So blocking controls are appropriate for either things that somebody doesn't need to do at all, and you just want to make sure it goes away, or things that are extremely severe. So for example, Strongpoint has a blocking control for granting administrator access, because once somebody's got administrator access, they can give any other access to anybody else. So a blocking control is appropriate there for some companies, but you generally want to use it where it's either not going to affect a workflow at all, or where it actually affects a very, very serious thing. Process controls are appropriate for meaningful things that occur very frequently and need to have good, tight controls around it, because there'll be too much to check on a detective basis. And detective controls are really good for picking up exceptions, things that aren't supposed to be happening, but if they did happen, we know they would come up, and particularly if they don't have, they would be the sort of thing that could be rectified prior to period close. Okay. So in the Strongpoint world, we think we have the corresponding tools that match onto this. So access controls, and we're not going to focus on product today, but access controls that actually enforce prior approval of access to the system. And it will be able to tell you whether or not only whether or not you had, somebody was given access, but whether you were given prior permission for that access. Permissions conflict rules, these are your standard SOD rules, library of rules and the ability to customize it and restrict them to different departments, locations, and subs, so you can have different roles in different parts of the company. And of course, the violation reporting running off that. And then master data and financial controls, which is really the detective controls that watch the master data, make sure that, and financial behavior to make sure that there's appropriate review process. And we have some special capabilities, because these controls are hard to build with saved searches, because often you require context. You need to compare data, if you shouldn't be doing A and B at the same time. And a classic example of this is monitoring for specific activity by admins, right? So these are all parts of an overall control rubric. So Amy, can you walk everybody through the different types of SOD activities that generally our customers get involved in?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Mark. So oftentimes from an audit perspective, we're required to do a couple different types of SOD types of reviews. One is that access review, right? We're reviewing roles and permissions that are assigned to people. And then we're also reviewing to make sure that those roles that are assigned are appropriate for those people, right? And oftentimes we're having to shrug through a lot of data, right? Especially with NetSuite, we can pull the data out, but typically it's like this time-consuming Excel exercise, and then we send it to the business, and the business oftentimes is just checking the box saying, yes, it's good. And then you have...
Can I interrupt you for a second, Amy? So the reason Amy's, by the way, using the word we is not because Strongpoint offers professional services to do this, but Amy is the former head of business systems at Nortec Core Brands. So when she says we, she means all of you and her, as opposed to me, and I'm software guy. So, but Amy's actually lived through this experience. So
yeah, sorry, I use we a lot because I don't feel like I've ever left that side of my life, right? I still have the customer point of view very fresh in my perspective, and so I often use we. And when I say we, I mean collectively we. Because I've been where you are, I've lived the life, I've defended against audit on lots of the big houses. So yes, when I say we, I mean collectively we. And so yes, I've had to truck through this access review twice a year, pulling data out of NetSuite, which we all know is not super easy, especially for an access review. And then having to chase the business down, right? Like having to, because it's not never the business's priority to, you know, check this box for us or review this, and they just want to do their job. And so this oftentimes is very time consuming, and you're chasing people down, right? And the next kind of activity is the SOD audit, where you have some, either a product or you have a lot of customers have whole teams of people that are doing analysis and spreadsheets about, you know, that SOD, that's actual segregation of the permissions in NetSuite, because NetSuite is really complex, right? We have about 650 plus unique permissions in NetSuite, and that's growing all the time. And to be able to do that analysis just in Excel is super nightmare. But even if you have a product that's doing this and that's running some rules against your permissions and your roles, oftentimes you're just getting like, here's the conflicts, and okay, great, but now what do I do with these conflicts, right? And it tends to be overwhelming, because, you know, we all, you know, especially if you've been in NetSuite for a few years and you have different hands in the pot, different consulting firms that have done your migration or your implementation, right? And they all have their own view on roles and permissions, and it's not easy for not native to NetSuite to create, you know, roles that have a native SOD as part of that role. So it becomes very difficult in a very large effort for analysis. And then, so then you have all those conflicts, and then now you all right, we have all these conflicts. Now we got to kick off a project to resolve those conflicts, identify and really go through the roles, find out what people are doing and not doing, or what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. And this, of course, is very time consuming, because you kind of have to have, you have to have that tribal knowledge to understand, one, what is that permission? What do those 650 permissions actually do? And then what is Jane with the accountant role actually doing with that permission of the, you know, vendor payment? So, so all of that's to say, right? Like, these are all very time consuming methodologies to attacking SOD. And all three of these are really required in order to have a compliant solution when it comes to roles and role assignments.
So the interesting thing about this, Amy, is that the audit itself, if you're using you know, our rule set or another rule set, can actually go quite quickly. The challenge is, if you don't set yourself up properly, you end up with, as you said, an overwhelming number of conflicts, and that becomes very difficult to manage.
Yeah.
So why don't you walk us through, you know, the old way and the new way that we've discovered, and how they differ from just a customer experience point of view. And again, we're not poking fingers at how everybody else did it. We used to do it this way, and we're moving to the new way, and we want to share that with you. But why don't you walk through what the differences are between the old way and the new way?
Right. So I think I touched on a few of those, right? Like in the old way, very expertise driven, right? So that tribal knowledge, understanding not only what all 650 of those permissions actually give you access to, but then also like how are those permissions assigned to roles, and how are your people using those permissions? And are they actually, and are they using it? Are they creating, are they editing, or are they really just kind of viewing that record? Are they only need to be a consumer of that data, right? And so without a methodology in order to attack that, it can become really overwhelming and frustrating very quickly. I've had customers that, you know, and to Mark's point, we have done it the old way. And I've had customers that come out of their the first engine run and look at their first results and have thousands of conflicts. And that can just be super overwhelming to try to attack, right? Because where do we start? Because this is, and then all of a sudden, SOD tends not to be, you know, the number one priority for your NetSuite team, right? We're all doing more with less. And so, you know, it becomes very overwhelming very quickly. And that project timeline tends to, you know, move out. There tends to be lots of meetings because no one person knows all these things, right? You might have a rock star admin that knows all the permissions and understands the workflows and how you're doing that from a NetSuite system perspective. But then they may not know about all of the things that the actual business is doing day to day, right? And Marcia's doing this crazy one-off every, once a week. And they may not know about all those things. So we have to ask Marcia, or we have to ask the business owners in order to understand what it is they're actually doing, or why they're using that permission, or why they need that permission. And oftentimes, right, this is very audit driven as opposed to like the business process driven, right? Where we're driving based on those rules and based on requirements from audit, as opposed to what is the business really doing, and how are they really doing it, and what are they touching, and maybe they shouldn't be touching this, and maybe they should just be a viewer of that, right? And because of this old way and tribal knowledge, we're adjusting roles, and we're trying to identify opportunities to segregate process, but that requires a lot of testing. Oftentimes, projects in the old way would get stuck on UAT, right? We get stuck in two ways. One, the lots of meetings and talking to the business, but the other way was UAT, right? So now we made some adjustments to the roles based on what we think is happening in the business. And now we're like, all right, great, we're ready to move these to production. But can you go into the sandbox, and let's just make sure that we're not crippling you, because that's not the intent. We're not trying to cripple your day-to-day operations, but we want to make sure the new roles or the changes to the roles are going to work for the team, right? And so UAT tends to be a long pole in the old way.
Right. So when we set out to come up with a new way, we decided we wanted to make something that was as efficient as the rest of the processes we automate, or approaching that anyway. I mean, obviously the things that we do around automated documentation, impact analysis, those are instant, right? So that's a very high bar to get to, but that's where we're going. So in order to go there, what you'd really want is to get rid of all the things we don't like on the left-hand side, but get the same result, right? And so what we realized is this had to be usage-based. What Amy was saying was there were some people who understood the permissions and some other people who knew what was going on, but even the people who knew what was going on weren't 100% confident they knew everything that was going on. Well, NetSuite knows what's going on, right? The system knows what's happening in it, and so we need to use that data. If we use that data, we can set really straightforward rules for what stays and what goes. And those rules are clear, and they're not just usable in the implementation of SOD, they're usable in access reviews afterwards, so that you can continue the same policy moving forward. And that makes things very efficient, because we're not sitting around going, gee, I wonder if Mary's using this. We know if Mary's using this, right? And therefore, with 100% confidence about what's going on in the system, we can make decisions about what to do super quickly. That turns it from an audit-driven discussion, and of course the auditors are critical players in this, the internal audit teams, and of course the point of view of the external audit teams is super important, but it turns the discussion, as Amy said, from a audit-driven, what are we going to do to pass audit, to what are we going to do, or what do we need in the system in order to facilitate the business? And that's what your access reviews are going to be going forward anyway, so we need to get on that foot right away. And then the result of that is that our goal is to have as little retesting as possible. So in order to do that, we don't want to make changes, if at all possible, that require us to retest things. And so often the mess that you get out of the old way in the way of testing it is so big that companies decide that an overall review of all roles de novo is the simplest path forward, because it's such a dog's breakfast that the work required to evaluate all the existing stuff is too much work, and that means that results in retesting of everything. Well, we realize, and we've now got the data to show it, that you don't have to treat it that way. You can in fact go through an SOD process and actually do very little retesting, because you know exactly what you need to test.
Right, because we know we have the usage data, right? And so we're removing those two roadblocks as part of the old way. And one of those is, right, usage space. So we know the answer. We don't have to go to ask anybody anymore. We know that they're not using it. We know that they're not creating and editing, right? And then because we know that answer, we're removing that roadblock of having to go through rounds and rounds of UAT with end users because we know you're not using it. So we'll just move it to view.
Yeah. So the other aspect of this is it changes it from being a consultant-driven activity to a company-driven activity, where you don't need a lot of outside expertise because the real knowledge is actually the knowledge that your system has. So the old approach, as we said, had a central flaw, right? Nobody on the team at all understood everything about the business and also understands the permissions well enough to make quick and clear decisions about what can and cannot be changed. So normally what happens is, so you can follow this across to the left, when people use NetSuite for 5+ years, there are decisions that were made over those years that are undocumented. Nobody knows why they were there. Nobody knows why those decisions were made. And it doesn't matter how much you know about permissions, you don't know everything you need to know about whether those permissions, or you can, but using, in the old approach, if you ask people, nobody will be confident that they know the answer, and therefore they won't be comfortable moving forward. So you do your audit, and you audit all the roles and all the users' assignments of those roles, and what you get is massive violations. In fact, it's not that uncommon for us to see every single role with a violation, right? And users with 2 or 3 roles, lots of users with 2 or 3 roles. And the one of those roles was supposedly the role they had in the first implementation, but then we did an update and the role was refined, but nobody ever took the first role away. And maybe the person logs in and uses that role every once in a while because there's something they need from that role. And so these violations all have to be reviewed one by one. Amy, you were telling me one customer had 10,000 violations.
Well, they had 7,000 violations, and this company was only in NetSuite 2 years, but they had multiple consulting firms in. And we, again, the collective we, were really good at making copies of roles and granting permissions because I need to do X, Y, and Z. Great, but we're really bad at taking those permissions away. And no end user is going to be like, hey, by the way, I can do this and I probably shouldn't. No end users are doing that, right? And so that's how this happens. And so, yeah, I had a customer that was in for 2 years, just barely 2 years, and had a violation of every single role and over 7,000.
Right, and so often we get brought in where the transition is, even when we were doing it the old way. We would be brought in, or customers would approach us because they would get to step 3 and go, whoa, we don't have time. We can't go through this process. So we're pretty sure Strongpoint is going to be able to navigate this data better because they look at it systemically. And that expectation was kind of great because we were picking up customers that way. But it wasn't, but we got very serious about fulfilling that expectation. That's what the second half of this is going to be about, explaining what we did. So because what they're trying to avoid was the next 3 steps, right? Bringing in a outside consulting firm. Often they had the outside consulting firm in the room, and the outside consulting firm's going, oh my goodness, this is going to take forever, and the company didn't have forever, right? And the reason the meetings go on endlessly and endlessly is because people are basically very nervous about removing the permissions that without the right evidence to support it. And then, as we said, you end up retesting everything. So this is what we've decided the secrets are to rapid SOD projects. And you don't need Strongpoint to implement these. There's some tools we've got to make it easier, but we think that people just need to start thinking about it this way. Number 1, do your access review before your SOD audit. And I don't mean an access review where you go and ask people if they still need the roles. A data-driven access review. You actually deep dive into the metadata in NetSuite, and you find out what's actually going on in this system. And the reason for that is every single thing you can clean up in the access review is something you're not going to have to deal with on the SOD, in the SOD conflict review. And more to the point, since most things have multiple impacts, like they don't just, a badly designed rule doesn't violate one rule, it violates a lot of rules. You're going to clean it, it'll be a one-to-many. So making one cleanup beforehand will help you clean up many other things and stop you having to do things. In order to do this, you need to decide that you're going to put some principles in place. And this is what we're recommending to people, that you go to your CIO and CFO, whoever owns the system, and you say, or maybe it's a committee, let's say it could be a committee at this point, and go, look, if a role hasn't been used by anyone in over 3 months, we're just going to inactivate it. And that will remove it from all of the users. And it won't get picked up on SOD review anymore. Because remember, the first thing is anything people are able to use, even if it's not assigned to anybody, will fall under SOD. So if there is a role that could be assigned and has an internal conflict, that's going to be an SOD violation. The second one is, if a role hasn't been used by a user in 3 months, remove it from the user. In other words, they leave their existing role behind. Obviously, if they only have one role and they haven't used it in 3 months, that's a different problem. They're probably no longer working for the company, and you have a different access control problem, right? But if they have multiple roles, just get rid of all those zombie roles. And you can use data to do it. I'll be pointing out how you do that at the end of this. The challenge for doing these first 2 steps is the data is so voluminous that it's very difficult to crunch. You can do it though. You just have to bite it off in lots of sections and do a bit of work. The Strongpoint will make it a lot easier. But this is going to massively reduce the pool of roles that you're now analyzing in most companies. Now, the third one is one that most people didn't realize they could do. If a permission inside a role has not been used by that role to create or edit a record in the last 3 months, set it to view. This is completely determinative inside NetSuite. You do not need to go around to people and say, hey, are you creating or editing anything? You don't need to ask people. The system notes completely show whether they've been doing it. And if anything, the system notes will over-represent that they are when they're not, because occasionally you can get system notes that show that somebody did something when in fact it was a consequence of something else they did. That means it's safe, right? It's a very safe way of looking at it. And when you set a permission to view, permissions can have multiple different settings. You can have, of course, none. You can have create, which means you can create things but not change other things. There's edit, which means you can create or edit. And then there's full. By the way, nobody should have full for almost anything except for the very few permissions that only have full, like full is on or off. Everything else, having people who have the right to delete things from your system who aren't admins is almost certainly going to cause you problems, right, on audit. But you want to look at people who are creating or editing records, and if they aren't doing that, just set it to view. Their navigation will stay the same, their dashboards will stay the same, everything will stay the same. The only thing is the editing or creating function they weren't using anyway will no longer work. You now put in a blocking control, super safe, right? And so you're using data to do this, not personal opinion. If you try to implement these 3 rules and you try to use people's personal opinion to do it, you'll be right back in the same mess, because that's effectively what we were asking people in the reviews anyway, in the old method. These are not new ideas. We're just saying, go out and get approval for applying these rules based on data from your senior management and from your internal audit team before you start the project. If you don't do this, just budget a lot more time and a lot more money for the project, right? Because time is money.
Yeah, the smoothest projects are when, executive and IAs are really partners with you, and we often play good cop, bad cop, and as part of the project. But those are the smoothest, is where you're getting those approvals in advance. Everybody's aware of what is going to happen, what we're doing, and that it's not just subjective. It's data-driven decision making.
And yeah, it makes everybody a lot more comfortable when you say, we're going to do a bunch of things in Sandbox, and we'll walk through it right now. And we are going to have evidence for every decision we made, right? That makes people feel a lot more comfortable, and it's much more straightforward. We're not doing stuff off the, side of our desks. We're doing things in a very methodical, evidence-based way. So your first step is, as you said, is going to be to clean up the roles. You're going to get your sponsorship. You're going to identify and inactivate any of the unused roles. This is like a wonder tool. If you hit that inactivate button on the user roles, when you go into editing user roles, hit inactivate, the user role stays, so you could use it again if you wanted to, but it disappears from all assigned users. Now the downside of that is if you activate it again, it returns to all assigned users, which you can either view as a feature or a bug, depending which way you think you'd like it to happen. But it does make it very, very safe because it's a reversible activity. Then you're going to remove your unused role assignments. So if somebody hasn't logged in, you're going to remove those. And then you're going to remove your the remaining users, or review the remaining users with multiple roles. And there's a saved search in our SOD pack for finding those people. And you can go through and then see if they really need it, because often we discover that somebody is using 2 roles solely to get access to 1 permission. And making that check now before you start running your conflict rules, again, it's going to save you some time. So, so normally, if people aren't actually using multiple roles, that will already have disappeared. So you want to do these things in order. You don't want to do them in parallel. Do them in order, because each one makes the second set smaller. Right? So once you've done that, you're now going to, and by the way, you're getting the data for this from production, but you're making the changes and doing this is in Sandbox. So it's really important that when you, prior to doing this, you refresh your Sandbox with the option turned on to move over all access, because then they'll have the right access in order to do this. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to run the SOD rules against roles only. You don't want to run it against people yet, because you just want to find out if there's any conflicts in the roles. And whether you're doing this, working with one of the major GSIs or advisory firms, and you're using spreadsheets, or you're using our tool actually has tools to specifically isolate and run only against user roles for this purpose. You want to only check the conflicts inside roles. And when you go to resolve the conflicts, your first thing you're going to do is look at the transaction type that's related, or the record type. It could be record, master data record, like items or entities, or transaction type. And you're going to check whether or not those things are in fact being used. Now, this is a search you can do inside NetSuite. It's relatively straightforward if you think about it, because all the system notes actually tie back to records, and you know what record type it is, and you can do all this. However, Strongpoint has all those searches already built, so that you can go in and very quickly determine whether in fact somebody's actually using the permission or not. And then if they aren't using the permission, then you can set that what you're going to do is for that role, you're going to turn that permission to view. The navigation stays the same, but that's the fastest way to clean things up, because you know for sure that there's no real conflict. And this is what we call phantom conflicts. And you want to get rid of those phantom conflicts for permissions that are in people's roles, but they're not using, because that's going to eliminate something in the order. Amy, what would you say in our customers, what percentage of their conflicts, leaving aside all the stuff that are either roles that they're not using, or assignments that they're not using, or permissions that are in their roles that they're not using?
I think I would bucket that in 2 large groups, right? One, in smaller companies, there's less phantom conflicts, right? Because you're doing more with less. But in larger companies, I would say at least 60%.
Yeah, right. So, and then once we go through, the next step is to go through and document all of your existing controls, because many, you may have actually avoided these in the beginning, because sometimes don't turn on rules for which there's a compensating control, because the rules, the segregation of duties is already enforced by a compensating control, like a workflow. But if your control is not a process control, and it's more of a detective control, which is quite common, then you just simply need to document that control and document the review of the control, and then you can resolve those conflicts. And once you've resolved them, then those user roles will be exempt. So for example, if somebody if somebody in theory has the right to create sales orders and approve sales orders, but there's a search that's reviewed that shows anybody who created and approved their own sales order, and that's reviewed by the controller, who doesn't have a dog in that hunt, that may be an effective compensating control. I'm not saying that is. I'll leave that up to your auditors to decide that it is. I'm just making a simple example. So often you will have those things. You just need to make sure that they're being reviewed on a regular basis and that you can document that they're being reviewed on a regular basis. Strongpoint has our agent system that's able to trap any of those incidents and put them all, incidents from all different controls, on the same review path for the controller or for whoever you're designating to review those. But that can be an effective control to mitigate the risk, because essentially you're saying, well, they could do it in theory, but we would trap it if they did do it, and we would therefore know, and it would never get out the end of our period, and therefore we don't have a problem, right? No fraud risk. And then, if necessary, you can build new controls. And if you need to build new controls, definitely looking at using agent, which takes saved searches and turns them into full trapping controls, is super useful. But saved searches are often the most direct way to solve this problem. You just have to make sure that there's proof of monitoring. That's the key thing for making effective controls. So once you've done this, you should have no remaining violations at the user role level. And as Amy pointed out, 60% of them you never had to clear up, and a small number of them you did. Now, it's possible that you might come across situations in which you look at it and you say, well, even though people are doing this and this, we could actually remove, change new roles and do all that. I would resist that impulse. If you didn't get rid of the permission by setting it to unused, then you're really skating on thin ice here. Once you start to edit those user roles, you're going to have to start doing regression analysis to figure out what you need to retest. And our objective is to not do that, right? So the next thing you get into is testing and resolving user conflicts. So these are conflicts at the user level. That means they either have global permissions, which they shouldn't have, but we would detect that if they did, and or they have multiple roles. And sometimes there's a legitimate reason why people need to have multiple roles. There's very rarely, the classic one is these people have this job, but when some of them are off, if anybody's off sick, somebody from this other job subs in, and in order to do that, they need to have a dashboard that shows the work that needs to be done, so they need to have access to the role. That's a classic example, right? And if you have that situation, you're going to have to deal with it by creating controls around this, because you won't, if you don't have enough people to divide the responsibilities up, there's really no other way forward. They absolutely need access to both roles, and it's the exception. So your control is, whenever that happens, we're going to, either your control is, we don't give it to them all the time, we just give it to them when they need it. That's rarely the right answer if you're dealing with, somebody's off sick, for example. The other answer is to say, well, even though somebody does this, we're going to look at what they actually do and put controls around that. And then, and if they do it, we're going to trap what they did and put that through subsequent review. So you put a control that doesn't have any data in it most of the time. It just has data when somebody subs in for someone else. So, if anybody with this role actually does any transactions with that role, we want to see what those are, right? That's a simple control to set up and very effective. So you go through, when you resolve that, you can now go live, right? And so you may have actually at some point decided you needed to fix a role. Like you may have decided way back that one of the people with multiple roles was really just using another role just because they needed one permission or something, and you may have made a change to a role. That's the only thing you're going to need to retest, right? All of the things, whenever you switch things to view, you don't need to retest after that, because the person wasn't using the transaction capability anyway, or the record, they weren't editing or creating records anyway. So therefore you're not likely to have, in fact, you're not likely, you won't have changed their process because they aren't doing anything that that would cause them to do that. So for example, you might be concerned that if somebody has a user event script and it executes in their role, they might, somehow that might need their permissions. No, that would show up in the data as them doing it. That's an example of they didn't actually do it, but the code did it. That would show up as them doing it. The other concern you might have is, well, what if there are scripts running against those roles? Definitely use Strongpoint. Strongpoint will show that right on the user role. It'll show all the script dependencies. You'll be able to see if there are any scripts that depend upon that role to operate. If they do, you might want to be super careful about whether or not you change any of the permissions, and be really careful about what that script does. That is so by far the exception than the rule that it doesn't materially impact the project. Right? And when you go live, you obviously are going to go through a request for approval, but you'll be able to go through a request for approval with the actual data. All these changes are just setting things that hadn't been used in 3 months, or hadn't been used in 3 months, to either inactive, or we remove these from these people, or we set these permissions to view, all based, and here's the data that proves it. And that will make your approvals go much more quickly because everybody will have the same confidence you do. Make sense? Okay, and the final step, of course, is to activate the rules that you've in production, and you will, you could get some violations you weren't expecting, by the way, because it's not like your populace of users stayed static. That's okay, just deal with them, right? It may happen, just deal. Don't go back and refresh and do it all over again 6 times over. Just when you go live in production, if you get any violations, resolve them. Right, make sense, Amy? Is that any other things you wanted to add to this?
Hey, Mark, I've been neglecting in the Q&A. I want to ask a few questions here. Let's see. Oh, will the access presentation? Yes, we will definitely forward on the webinar. So Beth must be a customer. Hi, Beth. She has a problem with some of the safe searches that you're referring to. And so Beth, I'll reach out to you separately. We can optimize those. If you have a lot of employees, or if you have a lot of roles, it is possible, that those safe searches could time out. We are beholden to the NetSuite governance. But we have some ways to optimize those safe searches. So I'll get with you. There was another question. This is a great question. How do you do this when you have small number of employees? And so they have multiple roles and they have multiple tasks. And so yeah, we're all doing more with less, and those people are actually doing those activities. And so I think as part of, as we go through this process, right, of the rapid approach, when we talk about addressing the real conflicts, right? We get rid of all the theoreticals first, great. And then now we have real conflicts, and real conflicts are gonna exist for everybody. Nobody has a conflict-free environment, nobody. And so to Mark's point, we will, in those 3 different ways, address with different controls, right? Do you have a workflow? Do you have a process control? Do you have a compensating control to address that risk? And oftentimes, your finance organization has, as part of their finance, as part of their risk matrix, that they have some sort of control in place that they're already monitoring as part of month-end process that we could leverage as a compensating control. And we'll help you document that control, and then we'll create an exemption for that violation or for that risk. And the good part about the tool is it's continuous audit product, whereas it's going to tell you immediately. So if somebody else has that conflict, so all of a sudden you onboard Tim, and now Tim has that conflict of the vendor record and the vendor payment, but that's Tim's job. But great, we got alerted, so now we know, and then you can make a decision. Do we add Tim to that exemption, or oh, we assigned an incorrect role, let's just remove that role from Tim, and that conflict will automatically resolve.
One of the things that we built into Strongpoint that makes this a lot easier is often the controls you need when you have these users with multiple different permissions is you can't tell by looking at the system notes whether they violated SOD. So we already know they've actually got the ability to violate SOD, but we don't know if they've actually violated it, because in order to figure that out, we have to compare 2 sets of data. We have to compare, a classic example we have is people who have role A who do X not in role A, right? Right. So it's because their main role is this, but occasionally they use this other role to fill in for each other or to cross do things, or people who did this but also did this in the same period, right? And being able to do cross matching sorts the wheat from the chaff, because you may have lots of incidents that don't cross that, the normal path doesn't cross that barrier, but sometimes it does. If it is the normal path that Mary or Fred or Bob have to do both parts of the transaction all the time, then the appropriate thing to do is either put an approval process on the record itself, but customizing for approval purposes is maybe not the best way to do things. Adding more complexity to your account just for the purpose of audit maybe is not a good idea. Maybe it's a better idea to use an agent, use a safe search that traps that incident, and then just have somebody review it and sign off on it. And you can do that with agent pretty straightforwardly. In fact, you can generate a PDF of all the results, run it every month, and people do this, for example, with administrator behavior all the time. Any other questions, by the way? We got a few more things to talk.
Yeah, so Paula, our friend Paula, is asking, NetSuite isn't great with explaining exactly what permissions do. Yeah, that matrix that they provide is not user-friendly. She's asking, does Strongpoint have that documentation available?
Yeah, we're working on it and making it, we're trying to figure out, yes, we absolutely do know. We actually have a very clear understanding that we've tested of what all the permissions do. What we have done is we've got in our methodology, we've looked at the 90-10, right? So there's some very simple things that if you understand them, can give you access to most of the power of what you need to do SOD. All right, there's all sorts of permissions. Out of those 600 and whatever permissions, a huge amount of them relate to things you either don't do, like you actually don't do, or your company doesn't do, or they relate to things that are set up, or they relate to things that you can't clear up in this way anyway, because there's no system notes of the use of that behavior. So we've really focused on the things that do leave behind a reasonable system notes trail, and mapping those very clearly. So, for example, our SOD rules abstract the actual permission into an explanation of the risk. So when you're doing this, you're not going through and looking at the permissions. You're saying, I have a violation of this SOD rule, and I know that the right-hand side of it relates to sales orders. So what I need to figure out is anybody who's violating, none of the SOD permissions or SOD violations have to do with looking at stuff. They all have to do with transacting in the broadest sense, like changing data. So if you now could say, well, what I want to find out is there anybody who's violating this rule that doesn't edit sales orders anyway? And there's lots of other things. When you see it expressed, it says things like, gives you access to the, et cetera task. Well, normally what that means is it gives you access to that interface element, that part of the navigation. And that's never relevant to SOD, right? What's relevant to SOD is, can you change the data? And so, so we do have a guide. In fact, we did a webinar on this a while ago, Paula, and I'll get the recording of that where I go through and I actually explain, how to read that. Actually, first I'll watch it again and see if it makes sense. But in response to your question, but we're working on a guide, another guide that says, look, this is how you understand, this is how you should understand it. But what we did mostly was focus and say, look, disregard everything. For purpose of SOD, we only care about the ability to create or change data. And therefore, and understanding that is much easier. And so if you go off the rule violations, it'll be much easier to understand. And Paula, I'd love to talk to you about it in more detail, or anybody actually, in more detail, because the reason NetSuite is documented that way is because those permissions do control the configuration of the interface, not just the transactional behavior, but for SOD, we only care about the transactional behavior. Make sense? So these are the different searches that exist in the system, as I think Beth pointed out, and Amy was talking about. Even compressing it in this way, you can run into problems with governance because of the amounts of data. These two first searches, user role not assigned and user roles assigned but not in use, is the first steps that Strongpoint's taking. Whoops, go back up. First step Strongpoint's taking to get around that. So the amount of data you need to go through to prove that a user role wasn't assigned to, and like proving a negative is difficult, right? So not assigned, or that it was assigned but not in use, it would be difficult. So Strongpoint already crunches that data in the background. So and the searches we have are actually it'll actually show you what's going on with those, and it won't take a long time to run. The role assignments with no login in 3 months, that's using raw NetSuite metadata, and the activity role searches, they're using raw metadata, and so you need to run it carefully. However, systematically they're correct. So you can just slice your time into smaller and smaller segments, and you can get your data, and it's not going to take you that long. Normally, we see for most customers, if you run it, instead of running it for all roles, for example, if you run it for one role or one transaction type in a 3-month period, most of the time it'll run just fine. And similar restrictions which our team can lead you through. So Amy, do you want to walk through finally what the normal timeline? When we talk about accelerating SOD projects, there's a big how long is a piece of string here, because we have had people do it in less than a month, and there are people who, particularly in the old way, who took very, very long periods of time to do it. Can you walk us through the different steps we need to go through and explain why we're putting these in different weeks?
Yeah, so regardless, this is still right when you're talking about permissions and user roles and all this analysis. It's not a quick thing. Although before COVID, when we were able to travel, we were doing this in a shorter time period. But typically, SOD is not your most critical priority, right? There's no SOD emergency that and so we typically take this approach of, great, let's schedule 1 or 2 sessions a week, depending on your schedule, and let's go through the methodology. And so, first, obviously, we're just going to get you installed, and we're going to go through the library and identify what's applicable to your organization, right? We do have, actually, it's 140 best practice rules right out of our library. And those are just dependent on how you use NetSuite, right? Everybody uses NetSuite differently. You might have physical inventory, you might not. You might be using recurring revenue. You might be using active. You might be using, ADP, right? So just kind of going through the library and understanding what's going to be applicable to your business. And then we'll decide on what rules we're going to enable, right? And then we're going to run the engine. And then we're going to go through those first steps of cleaning up the roles, the unused roles, and some of that, what I call a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? And we can get through that pretty quickly because we have that usage data. And then we move on to the real conflicts, right? And those can be a little bit more time consuming because we really do need to talk to people, bring in maybe the controller, and hopefully you have their sponsorship where they're coming in and talking about what their risk matrix is and what financial controls they have in place, and so that we can identify what those compensating controls are. And then so back to the minimize the amount of testing, right, is really because we are looking at actual raw data and usage. We want to only test the things if we're making changes to roles and permissions where it's part of existing process. Maybe you're like, oh, this person only does this once a month. you know what, this needs to go back to this other place. And that happens as part of the project. There's going to be definitely some opportunities there, but those are the only things we want to really go back to testing.
Right, and Amy, if I can just intervene, I really can't emphasize that enough, right?
Right.
If you have evidence that says that somebody has not, created the record in question or edited the record in question for over 3 months, it's not part of their business process, right? That's the decision that you're taking. So you're not going to go back and retest. If you set that to view, so they can see the data, but they can't change it. Right. The principle is they weren't changing it anyway, so it can't be part of their business process. Therefore, you don't need to retest the business process. If you were to remove that access completely, remove the permission entirely, that's not necessarily true. It may be quite part of their business process that they look at sales orders, right, and then act on it in some other way, right? So you need to be clear that you're only moving things back to view, and you're not removing the permission entirely. If you remove the permission entirely, there's no evidence of people viewing stuff. There's no system notes for looking at things. So you are now completely flying blind, and you would have to retest everything. So moving it only to view is critical to avoiding that testing debacle. And similarly, not redesigning roles if you can resolve the conflict with a compensating control is something to be avoided unless it's absolutely necessary, or if it's highly advantageous to the business. If you discover stuff that's just dumb, it's an accident of history, fix it, right? But you can decide to fix it now or fix it later. You figure out which is more work, fixing it now and retesting some things, or building a compensating control that you're going to get rid of later. You can figure that out in the project.
This is a kind of a very common timeline, but that, just to set expectations, right? This does involve not only a weekly session, but also homework, right? I'm going to give you guys homework, and you're going to run the engine, and we're going to go over these results together, and whatever we don't get through, you're going to go over those. And then decisions that are being made, for example, based on those 3 principles, right? Great, we're going to inactivate these roles, okay? Do that. We're going to remove these assignments. Great, do that. And we're going to update these permissions to view that aren't being used. So, there is typically an hour session and then an hour to 2 hours of homework.
Per week, right?
Per week, right, per week. So I just want to set that expectation.
So we have had some situations in which people on very, very tight timeframes have come to us with either SOD or other aspects of compliance in an emergency situation where there was an impending audit and a deficiency to be remedied, and maybe they didn't get to us right away, or where somebody thought they had a clear path and then they used an audit-based tool and discovered they had a complete mess on their hands. So because you can more or less count these up as groups of hours, with the exception of the resolving user conflicts and the resolving remaining conflicts, which might involve creating controls, most of the rest of the stuff are, as Amy said, hour to 2 hours, maybe a little bit extra homework around these things. So in a push, you can go faster. We just don't recommend it. Like, we don't recommend you do anything related to compliance in a rush unless you absolutely have a gun to your head, right? So, and people rarely do. So a 7-week time frame, most people should be able to get through it in that time frame, mostly because you've just eliminated a ton of busy work in the process.
So Mark, we're at the top of the hour. Just want to be cognizant of people's time.
Yeah, that's great. So are there any other questions, Amy, that came in?
Nope.
That's great. So thanks a lot for your time. The next thing we'll be talking about will be data-driven access reviews. That'll be coming out in Q4, and we'll have some announcements about that coming out, and you'll watch for that. It's basically taking the same principles, but applying it to your quarterly access reviews. Thanks for your time, everybody.
For your time, everybody. Have a great week.